are doing great artists who happen to be women. And this suggestion came from a member of our class who is still, it was our very first meeting. And at the end of it, he said, why don't you do more women artists? So he's here today, and so this is for you. Notice that all of these books are about women artists. They start with the word women. The one in the I put in the middle has great. It starts with a line through women. So these are great artists who just happen to be women. There's a video that I'm going to be posting online that says, why are there so few women artists? And I really recommend it. It gives some of the reasons. It's not that there's so few, it's just that there's so few who've had opportunity or have been recognized. Another participant recommended last term that we do something on the National Museum of Women in the Arts, and I hadn't known it. So another video I'm putting online is one that talks about this fabulous museum. The majority, by far, of the artists that I'm talking about today are represented in this fabulous museum. So to both of you, thank you for your suggestions. I'd also like suggestions in the chat online, whenever, from you as to what you'd like to see next term. I have some ideas, but maybe there's an artist, an era, a certain painting you want to see, certain museum, please let me know. So we're going to be talking first about a woman plopped into a man's world trying to do her art. Okay, with my apologies to the fine gentlemen that are participating today, we're going to have a couple of cartoons from a book that I got recently called Men to Avoid in Art and Life. Now, present company accepted. Please, this is not a feminist rant that I'm going to be doing today. So the cartoon on the left is taking an art piece where the man is looking at the woman's art and saying, yes, Cupcake, I'm sure you gave it your very best effort. And on the right, we have her showing her masterpiece to the gentleman who has his finger in a book, and he says, see, it says here, using that kind of brush is, and I quote, not ideal. Now, there's their little warning sign, personal digression. This is, my father kept doing cartoons to my mother throughout their life. This was a Valentine cartoon where it shows him laughing hysterically, holding up a Peanuts cartoon, where Charlie Brown is teaching his sister how to make Valentines. And he's saying, hey, look, honey, this is me trying to teach you how to draw. And she says, you are the ink blob in the beautiful portrait of my life. So there's a little rivalry going there. Both of them were artists. And another cartoon, two women looking at a piece saying, it's all significantly less impressive once you realize these guys had free childcare. Well, opportunity for women did lack through most of the time. The most of the time that I was growing up, even studying art in college, the idea of women artists outside the home was not something you really heard of that much. So here's Carrie Fisher. A woman's place is in the, well, most of the early artists, they were in the home, but many of them ventured afar. For example, the Impressionists concentrated on different domestic type scenes. Here's Maurice, who we've looked at before a couple of times. Look at her wonderful, almost post-impressionist quick brushstrokes in her self-portrait on the left. And then on the right, a portrait of her by her brother-in-law, who was Edouard Monet. And in the middle, a domestic scene showing off her ability with the sparkling water, the dappled sunlight that's so impressionistic. But here's some paintings we haven't seen looked at before from her, which are a little bit unusual, definitely impressionistic, sun dappled, sweet colors, pastel-y colors. But here we see her husband, Eugene Monet, Edouard Monet's brother, who is doing the domestic scene playing with their young daughter. And this painting, which I think is absolutely magnificent, it was painted with Eugene Monet and Berthe Morisot on vacation in England on the Isle of Wight. And it is a picture that's talking about looking. Look at the binoculars down in his hand, down at the bottom. We can think that perhaps earlier his eyes were trained on the seaside out the window. But now Berthe Morisot is saying that perhaps his eyes are trained of the woman who's passing, who she sort of slashed through the middle. Look at that wonderful lace work. We'll see in another Berthe Morisot later on that she's able to give that translucent look. But I also want to tell you that I'm going to be putting another article in the chat on my website that analyzes this particular painting. This article was sent to me by one of the participants in the class, and it talks about it. The article has text and then it zeroes in on the painting. I've never seen an article do that, so I recommend that. Mary Cassatt, our American impressionist. Look at the middle self-portrait there, how similar that is to her friend Morisot. And she broke the rules a little bit. Domestic scenes, once again, on the water and with the child. But her perspective was ahead of time. She was really showing us as if we're sort of like up and looking down on the scene, and the unusual color blocking. For example, the on the left with the chartreuse and the big blocks of color, and then all of the upholstery in the same color, which was breaking the rules a little bit. And here she's really going afar, because what do these paintings remind you of? Once again, they are in the home, domestic scenes, as the Impressionists were all doing. But this style is definitely not impressionistic. The bath, the mother's caress, and the mother's kiss. Well, if you said they look like Japanese woodblocks, you're absolutely right. Here are the same topics. The woman who's feeding the baby, the woman admiring her baby, the woman who is playing with her baby. The Impressionists, the post-Impressionists were very, very influenced by these woodblocks. It is the up-close cropping of the picture, also the flatness, the no shadows that bring the subject out that they were admiring. Okay, let's talk about a woman painter that I have talked about earlier, 17th century Dutch. Here she is on the left doing one of her typical scenes of a musician, all dolled up in lace that she's beautifully shown through her painting, looking at us with the same little smile that she puts on many of her paintings. And then about 40 years later, still with her palette and brush, looking out at us a little bit warily. Here's typical genre scenes from 17th century, the Netherlands. There's our skull over there, remember, from Still Life. Notice how well defined she has the shadows and working through the three-dimensional forms of the characters. But what she is best known for, or perhaps least known for, is the fact that she was mixed up with Frans Hals, who had very similar paintings. On the left, you see this shading that I just talked about in a Judith Leister with a lute player. On the right, a lighter sort of a touch quicker brush strokes, not as tight of painting with Frans Hals. They knew each other and they were rivals. On the left is her jolly companions that for many years, as a matter of fact, 200 more years, was thought to be a Hals. And finally, when it was ended up at the Louvre, they found her signature on it. Before that, they said it was one of the finest of the Frans Hals, but not thinking Judith Leister, a woman, could have done it, they attributed it to Hals. Do you know this painter? Extremely famous in her time, Elizabeth Louise Vigée-le-Brun. Beautiful woman, showing herself painted there, looking straight at us, dressed up, saying, I'm successful, I can do this, I can handle it. Her beauty got in the way, although she did become extremely successful. But there were many that said, she's too beautiful to be able to paint the way she does. There must be a man in the background. Look at her portrait on the left. It's a self-portrait of her with her daughter. She is saying in this portrait, she is giving you signs of her heritage. Now, I learned in one of Renee Curry's classes in literature how authors do this. They give a little sign in their writing that I belong to this heritage. Now, this is a terrible example. For example, somebody walks into the room and they say, well, I just felt like a great white whale. And somebody thinks, well, this art writer is giving homage to Herman Melville. So here she is showing that she is in line with Raphael by the same positioning of his Madonna. And many Madonna scenes, many Holy Family scenes were done in this way. On the right, I'm showing a Greek statue with a toga. She is wearing that. She's not wearing 18th century type of dressing. She is showing that she is in the heritage of great classical art. And here she is on the left in her shepherdess hat. She and her model Marie are both wearing these shepherdess hats. You may have heard that in the 18th century, the women liked to play shepherdess, play as if they were peasants. So they had little model farms and they'd play at it. So here she is all dressed up with her palette and brush with hers. Her plume is slightly less magnificent than the plumage of the lady on the right. The lady on the right is also wearing a cotton chemise dress, which we'll find out a little bit later was quite scandalous. Well, maybe you figured out that her model was the Queen of France, Queen Marie Antoinette, who was the queen with Louis XVI. These are by Vigée-le-Brun. She was the court painter to Louis XVI. Look at Marie on the left, not in her shepherd's hat, although she certainly does the plumage, but that magnificent dress, so beautifully painted. She was called the best mirror in Europe. People were dying to have them do her portraits, and she did portraits of other royalty. We see Marie Antoinette on the right, a little bit less frilly here, but in both cases, there's her crown on the table. And look at the one on the right with her little royal foot on the royal cushion there. There's no mistaking, this lady's a queen. And then on the right, Marie Antoinette asked Vigée-le-Brun to please paint her as a homebody. Now there's a rumor that Marie Antoinette said, let them eat cake when starving people were asking for bread. I saw it discounted a few times, so I'm not sure. But she did want Vigée-le-Brun to show her as a homebody here with her children, including the one on the right, Louis XVII, and an empty cradle that is there because she lost one of her children. And as we know, Marie Antoinette and Louis XVII came to a tragic end at the guillotine. And after that, Vigée Lebrun painted Marie Antoinette, no hat, no plumage, no wig, in a very simple cotton chemise dress. Now, the reason that chemise dress was, I read someplace, became scandalous was because cotton became the rage. Whatever Marie Antoinette did, everybody wanted to do. And there are those who were saying, and that was the beginning of the interest in having cotton clothing. And how do you grow cotton? You grow cotton with slavery, which began because that is just what I read. Do you know this painter? Rosa Bonner was widely considered to be the most famous female painter of the 19th century. Her father told her, just hope that you can be as famous as Vigée Lebrun. Well, let's look at a little bit of a video to tell us about Rosa Bonner.
Rosa Bonner is one of the most important women artists of all times. I think it's a fair thing to say. She was extremely famous in her own day, not just in France, but also abroad. She was really the first female artist to reach that level of international fame. It's very important to stress. Rosa Bonner was born in 1822 in Bordeaux, and her father was actually a painter. She was mischievous, boyish, and very lively child, and she had decided that her interest was in animals and that she would draw and paint animals. She was successful from a very young age, and her father so much believed in her that he predicted, and I quote him, she would surpass Madame Vigée Lebrun. She started exhibiting her work at the salon when she was 19, and she was very soon awarded medals, doing very well as a very, very young woman. By the time she was 30, she was able to buy a chateau where she kept all kinds of animals, horses, yak, even lions, which would serve as subjects, of course, for her paintings. What really confirmed and consolidated her reputation was the horse fair. She started to work on it in 1851, and which she sent to the Salon in 1853, and that was a springboard to global fame. This is a painting which is now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and the painting which we have at the National Gallery is a reduced version by Rosa Bonner of that very large work. She started to regularly attend horse markets in Paris twice a week for a year and a half, so she was very committed. It was, of course, extremely unusual for a woman to attend horse markets at the time. It was a very, very much a male sphere. And in fact, Rosa complained about being repeatedly harassed. To avoid this, she actually requested from the Paris police authorities a special permission to be allowed to wear male clothes, an artist's smock, trousers and boots, and she obtained it because she wore her hair short and had a quite boyish manner, meant that she could work and focus on her project completely undisturbed. She is there sketching in a male crowd, depicting a very male scene. The rider right in the middle of the composition wearing a blue smock. This is believed to be Rosa Bonner's self-portrait, gazing straight at us. She was actually quite keen on communicating that image of a woman artist dressed in male attire. Even though she was modern, critics judging her art and the public wasn't necessarily that advanced. The reviewers always remarked the fact that these works were actually done by a woman. This is so good, it could almost have been done by a man, and were completely unable to judge her work independently from that factor. It was very hard for a woman intent on pursuing an artistic career to even train as an artist. It was believed that women would stay at home, and it is very much the kind of fate that Rosa wanted to avoid. She had seen what had happened with her mother, who she said was solely preoccupied with the care of her home and her interior. She had higher ambitions and was determined to pursue her own Rosa Bonner never married, but she had a long-time partner, Nathalie Mikas. She had first met Nathalie Mikas when she was 14, a kind of childhood sweetheart. They ended up living together for so many decades. She was pretty unambiguous about her sexual orientation, and I quote her, "As far as males go, I only like the bulls I paint." She also said that her private life was basically no one's business and didn't want to be judged for her sexual preferences. Rosa Bonner is still relevant today because she really extended the scope of possibilities offered to women, not just as a painter, as a woman artist, but also as a woman at all. She produced images which have had an enormous popular appeal. She led her life in an incredibly modern way and had no care what people thought about her. She pursued her own trajectory. She was quite close to Napoleon III and his wife Eugénie. As Eugénie once said, genius has no gender, and I think this is a good way of summing it up. It encompasses everything about Rosa Bonner.
So she was an artist and a woman and lived life in her own way. You can see her on the left with some of the animals that she would paint. We see the horses on the left. We see a pride of lions here in the framed piece that she's working on. We see in the back some of her sculpture. We see the woman that she was living with. She actually had two partners after one passed away, and the three of them are buried near each other in Paris. There's a book here on the left called Art is a Tyrant. And she says that I know nothing else, feel nothing else, think nothing else. We'll see this for several of the artists that we're looking at today. In the middle, you see a palette where when she was finished with it, she did a little lion. And on the right, that picture book that could be for adults or for children about her animals, about the animals that she kept in the menagerie at the chateau that she was able to buy. She was quite wealthy. She was very successful. Her paintings really sold. It's what the market was looking for. They weren't looking for the Impressionists who were working at the same time. That was modern art and a little bit wary, but her stuff really sold. There you see her with one of her things. It looks like a cheetah up there at the top, one of her things, one of her animals. Look at the photorealism. This is the signature of Rosa Bonnero. This is why it was so popular. Also look at how the animals, which are almost photographic in the front, the backgrounds are painterly. So there's no doubt that this is still a painting. There's the horse fair that was mentioned. On the right, you see the detail of Rosa Bonner riding behind the beautiful, magnificent horse that is rearing it in the picture where these white horses are highlighted with a shaft of light that's coming through. The action on this picture is really fantastic that she was able to catch. Once again, look at the realism. It's almost three-dimensional, like you could walk up to those oxen. But then look at the background, which has looser brush strokes. And we heard her quote about males. And look at the loving way in which she has painted this bull on the left. And as I said, she was also a sculptor. So we have the bull on the right that she sculpted. In here, this lovely picture of cows and a horse underneath the shade. Think about this. I'm going to be showing you a picture in a minute that this reminds me of. I don't know if it reminds you of anything. It reminds me of something in our local area. Beautiful use of the sun being filtered through the trees in the way she's portrayed it. And then I have our old friends over here that you remember. The top one is by Chagall, and the lower one is by Franz Marc. Here is more, two more on the top. We have the transportation of the sheep between pastures on the left, And on the right, the sheep that are grazing near the sea. My connections here were down at the lower left, the scene in the wonderful movie that came out last year, First Cow, Kelly Reichardt film, where the first cow that came into the Oregon Territory came in by this little barge. And then in the middle, here's that scene. I was wondering if that cow picture reminds you of anything. Yeah, that's Mission Ranch in Carmel. And on the right, when I saw the sheep grazing near the ocean, immediately I went to the wonderful scene you see as you're going down Highway 1, the cows grazing next to our Pacific. Now we're going to look at artists who really broke out from the mold, broke out in style, broke out in subject matter. I like this poster. They whispered to her, "You cannot withstand the storm, delicate women, you know." "I am the storm," she whispered back. Georgia O'Keefe. We did have a session about her, who broke all the rules, was doing her work entirely from her own talent, her own imagination. Flowers were part of her work. There she is outside Abiquiu, outside her home near Santa Fe, with an almost totally abstract work of the sun around where she lived. Then, of course, there were the flowers that people like to say had some kind of connotation with female sexuality. She denied it. So since she denied it, I will say probably isn't true, but I will say that on their own, the flowers are magnificent. The picture in the middle is showing several of the tropes that she worked with: the skull and antlers, the flower, magnificent sky, and the landscape. And then look at the style that she did the landscape on the right, layering it like she did the folds of the flower. This one is in New York, where her husband that lived on 3,000 miles away, and they were at Lake George. She did this jewel-toned reflections of Lake George. And then when she hung it, the first time it was hung, she hung it vertically, so that it turns into realizing that it could be a total abstract. She did it her way. Do you know Suzanne Balado? Suzanne Belladonna is a painter that I heard of when I was studying art. And the only way I heard about her was that she was a mother of a famous painter. Had no idea what she did, and I blown away by what she did. Completely on her own. This is now the early part of the 20th century. We have post-impressionists, we have Matisse, we have Picasso. They all knew each other. Look at her portrait, self-portrait at the age of 60, showing her sort of looking like in the same expression she has in her photograph, with a wistful kind of a look. Look into her eyes. Eyes will be important with Balado, as well as with another artist that we're going to be looking at later. She was a model, a painter, and a rebel. That's the title of the book that was done on a show that's currently running in Philadelphia. I'll tell you about in a second. On the left, you see a book that's called Renoir's Dancer. She was the model for that painting. And on the right, we have Mistress of Montmartre. And she was a mistress in many ways. She had quite a loose, lusty kind of a life. She did it her way. You may recognize the picture on the right by Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. They were great friends of her. He called that picture the hangover, but of course she wouldn't be having a hangover yet. She was just sort of spacing out. And on the left, we see her looking pretty prim and proper by Henri. And here's her son, her illegitimate son. She had a lover who took who gave the son her name. She's never said who the father was. Maurice Utrillo, you see them in the picture here. And then on the right, you see two of Utrillo's paintings. He specialized in paintings of Montmartre. That's of course the on the top of the hill that dominates Paris with the Sacre-Cœur, the white church behind that you can see in the top. There's the windmills of Montmartre, which give their name to Moulin Rouge, the mill being a moulin. So we have a picture here of mother and son. I paint with the stubbornness I need for living. And I've found that all painters who love their art do the same. Well, we're going to see stubbornness. We're going to see women who really had to fight for their places as we go on. But this is Suzanne Balado. This is her picture on the left. It is not pretty from my point of view. It is the same subject as the two pictures to the right, which are relatively pretty. The one in the middle by Titian and the one on the right by Degas. What makes it not pretty on the left? Well, the pose is a little awkward. And although we're used to seeing various colors in the skin, I mean, look at Degas on the right. These are kind of blotched on sort of carelessly. And the perspective, she's squeezed in to this tight little area. So I think that for many, the first view of that picture is not particularly pleasant. She didn't want to do just pleasant pictures. Now, here is a self-portrait of her on the upper left, posing as you saw her on the cover of the catalog. Cigarette in hand, awkward pose. Can you pick out where we have in this series of paintings, similar paintings in the same pose, so we can sort of say what she was doing differently? Well, to her right is a Titian, that beautiful skin, the languid pose. Let's compare poses. And then lower left, there's our Olympia, who we know was a prostitute. She's being brought flowers by a maid. She's completely ignoring the flowers, looking out at us, saying, look, I'm in charge here. To the right is, oh, that's by Monet, is Goya's Nude Maya. And then down the right-hand side is the biggest influence on Belladonna, and that's Matisse. Matisse also had these languid poses, but they were much more realistic, and he just loved pattern, particularly stripes. And Belladonna used as an homage to him in her picture. Look at the eyes. Look at the realism of these people that are dressed in modern clothing. This would be the early 20s, looking right at us. Three female posers who seem to be in either reverie or curiosity. And again, this tight composition cropped quite closely. And here she is, the everyday scene of a grandmother putting a shoe on the young daughter. We think back to the domestic scenes we just looked at, the Impressionists. And then on the right, here's a painting that I think has a story, and perhaps you can see a story in it. We see a woman, probably the mother, who's drawing a young pubescent girl after her bath. The girl is ignoring the mother, but looking in a mirror. Down below, there is a doll that's been tossed. The picture is called The Abandoned Doll. It and the daughter are wearing bright pink bows. So perhaps it's talking about a mother wistfully looking at her daughter who has grown out of childhood, abandoning the things of childhood. And she's thinking about her growing into her adulthood. On the left, we have a painting that was one of Suzanne Balladon's first breakthrough paintings. And then we have the announcement that right now in Philadelphia until January, there is a retrospective. It's the first one that's ever been in the United States of Suzanne Balado. I've talked before about this magnificent museum, which started in Alfred Barnes' home, where he grouped all the paintings according to the paintings themselves, not by era, not by artist, but so you really look at the paintings. And he said, never show this in any other way. Well, his whole home collection was transferred to the museum at the top, in downtown Philadelphia. Now we have as they would say in Monty Python's, something completely different. This is a photograph of the next artist. She was a Swiss Dada artist, or they call her a surrealist, I'd say Dada, who modeled for the Dada artist, Man Ray. Man Ray was a photographer in the Dada era of the 20s and 30s. Here's more photography that he did of our artist, Merit Oppenheim, Swiss. And we'll see her masterpiece in a minute. There's Man Ray. Here she is posing with a printing press with ink all over her head. And then on the right, I would say that she's gonna go swimming. That looks like a swimming hat to me, swimming cap. But in a minute, we'll talk a little bit more about this style. I'm not really sure. There's her masterpiece. It's called Object 1936. And I left off the rest of it. It's also called Object 1936, Breakfast with Fur. Now, it is a play on Luncheon on the Grass. And we have here fur-lined cup, fur-lined saucer, and spoon. There are those, once again, who see sexual connotations in this, and she kind of says, yes, you're sort of right. Here's some of her fashion statements that were art for the Dada period. The left and the right shoe joined together like perhaps a couple, amorous couple. The rat slippers in fur, the shoe with fur and a little pedicure, and these gloves with a manicure coming out. This was Dada. Dada was silly. Dada was a complete anti-art movement, saying anything can be art if you take it out of its normal utility and give it an artistic presence. It was so counterintuitive that it sort of broke the mold for what would come next. This is her spring banquet or cannibal feast. It was an installation that she did in different venues, sometimes with a mannequin, sometimes with a live model. But it has a double meaning here of attitudes about women just being there for the consumption of men. Do you know Tamra de Lempicka, called the Baroness with a Brush? Well, she wasn't born a baroness. She married a baron in her second marriage. Her first husband was named Lempicki, but she made it a little bit more classy by adding the de and making it Tamra de Lempicka. She was a glamour girl. She was the it girl of the Roaring 20s and of the 30s. Here we see two poses of her on either side. And in the middle, her most famous picture. There's that hat again. I'm going to be talking about that. This is her in Tamra in a green Bugatti, a self-portrait. And it was an iconic portrait of the modern woman of the interwar period. There's that hat. And I'm comparing it with Merritt Oppenheim. And then while I was working on this presentation, I happened to see the Emmys. And at the Emmys in London, I saw that sweet little Emma Corwin who plays Princess Grace on The Crown. And this was her Emmys outfit. I thought, oh my God, that hat, she's paying homage to Tamra de Lempicka. I'm sure that there's a reason. And look at her gloves and manicure. That might be back to Merritt Oppenheim also. So weird connections. Now, the thing that Tamra de Lempicka was known for, above all, was her style that was based on Art Deco, which was all the rage when she was painting. That, of course, the quintessential, certainly in the United States, is the Chrysler Building. And all those triangles in there, those facets, like little facets of diamonds, sharply defined, pointed shards, those are one of the hallmarks of Art Deco. So you see it in different works here, and we'll see it throughout her work. On the left, there she is with those veiled eyes, the little look that she had. Her second husband is in the middle picture. There, that's the Count. The Art Deco style, look at it, look at the lapels, those are those shards that I was talking about. Look at the folds in his sleeve, and look at the architecture in the background. And then there was a woman on the right. Again, look at some of the same characteristics, particularly in the background. She painted men, and she had men who were lovers. And here are two that are stylized. The one on the right is not so much Art Deco, but you still see that sharp molding of the characters. She was with women, and she had many portraits of women that were far ahead of their time, quite lusty. Here she is posing with one of them. She is currently in favor with several celebrities, primarily Madonna, who used Tamra de Lempicka in several of her videos. Here's her daughter. She painted throughout her life. And look at the little blonde curls there. They look sort of like shavings, you know, wood shavings or metal shavings. Art Deco, sharply defined. So also in the teddy bear, and of course the ruffles in that sharp planes of Art Deco. The girl as an adolescent. Here we have in the background the Art Deco architecture. And on the right, her Adam and Eve, done in the style that she was so famous for and was very, very well accepted, very popular. Contrast this with Masaccio on the left, the rather sweetly portrayed, let's say, Adam and Eve that are coming out. And then Michelangelo, who defined in all of his figures the musculatures, very into anatomy, and how she's taken a step beyond, defining it in that Art Deco way that we talked about. New painter, a new artist, Louise Nevelson. I'm not a feminist, I'm an artist who happens to be a woman, another woman who did it her way. Now she has sculptures all over the world, many of them in New York, huge sculptures, but I'm concentrating on these sculptures that she did where she took found objects, arranged them in a composition in a box, painted them all one color, and turned them into works of art. Now, this is not like Dada, because when we talk about composition, it's kind of like with music. If you're listening to music, particularly not listening to atonal music, but music that has a beginning and an ending, it sort of pleases the rhythms inside your body. The same thing happens with composition. It just works that there's a balance in it. Here she has sunglasses, a water gun, other toys that she's put into a box and turned into a work of art. Great craft for your children or grandchildren also, or you. I think I'd like doing it. I call these altar assemblage or assemblages. Here she's using the gold color. She used white, gold, and black primarily. And she's made these big constructions and put them together, and it ennobles the original objects, which were detritus, things that she'd find around New York, and put into these boxes. Here's a whole room that she did, and this was a wedding. So that in an imaginary, abstract way, she has the bride and groom on the left, the altar in the back, and the participants on the right. And her masterpiece is called Mrs. N's Palace, and it's at the Museum of Modern Art. I don't know if it's on view right now. And it is sort of an homage to the city of New York. It was unveiled on her 80th birthday. She'd spent 13 years making this. You can walk around it and you can see inside it. Okay, our next artist will be the last one before our break. So we might break a little bit late. By looking at the picture on the right, you see a picture of what is above the eyes of an artist whose life looms larger than her art. And I think just with those clues, the majority of you would know who the artist is that we're going to talk about. Perhaps one of the most well-known female artists of our time, Frida Kahlo. We saw her husband Diego not too long ago, and here she is in a photograph in one of her self-portraits. So here is a video telling us a little bit more about her. I couldn't find ones that weren't sort of outrageous, but I think this one has a pretty good storyline.
If I ask you which artist wasn't afraid of tackling social issues, sexual identity, political activism, and nonconformity, you would probably think I was talking about a current artist, right? Well, you would be wrong. I'm talking about the one and only Frida Kahlo. Don't believe me? I bet I can change your mind. Watch this. This episode is funded by the Glick Fund and the Crystal DeHaan Family Foundation. Frida Kahlo was born in Coyoacan, Mexico in 1907 in La Casa Azul, a tiny blue house where she lived most of her life. By the time Frida hit age 6, she contracted polio, which caused her to be bedridden for over 9 months. But that didn't stop her. In school, Frida was known to be very outspoken and brave. Her dad was by far her biggest champion and encouraged her to play soccer, swim, and even wrestle. Of course, at the time, girls were not known to play sports, let alone wrestle. It was about this time that she saw this guy, Diego Rivera, painting a mural in their school. Frida, who was a bit younger than him, like 20 years younger, told a friend, "I'm gonna marry him." Life went on, and in 1922, a bus Frida was riding in collided with a streetcar, and she was seriously injured. A handrail impaled her hip, and her spine and pelvis were fractured. I can't even imagine the pain she was in. The accident left her in a full body cast for 3 months. To kill the time, her parents bought her paints and built her an easel she could use in bed. In 1928, that same man from years earlier, Diego Rivera, discovers Frida and her paintings and is super impressed. They were married a year later. Their marriage wasn't exactly average, and they were often referred to as the elephant and the dove, which seems pretty accurate. Both had several affairs, one of which Diego had with Frida's sister, so needless to say, it was complicated. Frida often traveled with Diego as he was commissioned for murals throughout the US. Frida was often seen in New York with her signature bright gold, beautiful clothing, which celebrated her culture. Soon after, Diego gets himself into a dispute with the Rockefellers over this mural, and they head back to Mexico. In 1939, Frida heads to Paris, where she gets to meet artists such as Joe Miro and Pablo Picasso, who loved her work. In fact, the Louvre bought one of Frida's paintings, the first ever from a Mexican artist. Unfortunately, Frida's health continued to deteriorate, a story told through this painting called The Broken Column. Finished in 1944, this gives you not only a glimpse into the health struggle she had, but also the incredible artistic skill she possessed. Frida definitely used art to express all the physical challenges she faced, which was incredibly brave. But it doesn't stop there. In 1950, she got gangrene in her right foot and was bedridden for 9 months, and eventually had to have part of her leg amputated. However, she still kept creating and staying politically active. In fact, in 1953, she had a solo exhibit, and on the opening day, she had her bed delivered to the gallery and had to arrive via ambulance. That is determination. Unfortunately, soon after, on July 13, 1954, Frida passed away just before her 47th birthday. I'm not sure which part of Frida's story is more powerful, her struggle and ability to keep working despite her health, or the work itself. Frida's fame has grown since her death, especially in the 70s during the feminist movement, as she was admired as an icon of female creativity. Let's face it, she makes Wonder Woman look like a joke. Yeah. By the way, the film Frida that was released in 2002 was incredible. You should definitely check it out. Until next time, be outrageous.
So that's a little idea of her life, which, as I said, looms larger, I think, than her painting. And I think that a lot of times the painting is just sort of put to the side. She's also shown in the movie that Salma Hayek did called Frida, which is a biopic. And then there's a documentary. Of course, you can find many more online. Painting completed my life. She is saying the same thing that many of the artists talk about, whether they're male or female, that it's something that they need to do. She says, I paint self-portraits because I am so often alone, because I am the person I know best. I have a feeling that most of you would know Diane Arbus. She is famous, like with Sylvia Plath and David Foster Wallace and Anthony Bourdain. Sometimes these people who took their own lives at the end are known mostly for that, and it overshadows their work. But she was really a fantastic photographer. So let's look at some of her work. What is important, I think, to look at here in Diane Arbus is point of view. Now here's two perfectly fine ladies. And I would just ask you, you don't have to put it in chat or anything, but what your initial reaction is. They're dressed to the T's. It's called Ladies at the Automat. And most of you know that the Automat was a place where you could go in and they had these little glass boxes, like post office boxes. You put your coin in, open it up, and take out a piece of pie. You can see their condiments there on the table, but they look as if perhaps they're dressed to go someplace perhaps a little fancier. But this is the portrait that Diane Arbus took of the ladies at the Automat. Just wondering about your first reaction. Here are two other people, the woman with the pearl necklace and earrings, and a young man in curlers at home. I'm not going to tell you my reactions yet. Perhaps you have a point of view on these people. Perhaps Diane Arbus had a point of view on how she cropped it, on the expression on their faces that she chose, at what kinds of people these may be. I've already talked about the one on the left, which I think is one of her most famous photographs of the twins, that there was something just a little bit eerie about these lovely young girls in this picture. Here they are, older, holding a picture of themselves. I said this when we were looking at Munch and The Scream. And he had a little picture of a little girl that I thought was slightly off. Well, I knew that Edward Monk was slightly off. So I saw a little bit of another feeling about her in this picture. And then on the right, women who are wearing the same bathing suit. Of all the people on the beach, these are the ones that Diane Arbus chose. She chose that she had many pictures to choose from that she took of them, and this is the one. Do you get a feeling that of what perhaps she's conveying through the photograph? Nothing can be not subjective. Everything is subjective. The second she clicks her camera, that's a choice. The contact sheet, the exact image she chooses, the setting, everything is a choice. So is there something she's trying to say? She tended to want to photograph many people who were marginalized, either from mental or physical disabilities. And I'm not showing very many of those, but the one on the left I'm showing because I think it's an absolutely gorgeous photograph on its own. The subject matter is a little bit difficult. They seem to be people who are in a mental institution who are perhaps trick-or-treating, going out on some type of an excursion. I say trick-or-treating because the lead woman is wearing a mask. Well, I immediately jumped to my old favorite, Peter Bruegel the Elder, and his blind leading the blind. I saw tremendous, I don't think that was purposeful with Arbus, but I saw this, where in the picture on the right, the leader, who of course is blind, has fallen into a pit, and they will all follow. Now, this is my Arbus art lesson. As I said, I look for point of view in Arbus. And when I saw this picture of the boy, the way his hand is all clenched together, his thin legs, the stretching of his mouth, I thought this is one of her disabled people, deformed people. And look at the painting on the right, on the left that I chose to show you as my connection. Giuseppe de Ribera's The Club Foot. Velázquez, Goya, Ribera, these Spanish artists, so many of them tended to show people who had different types of deformities. The next picture, I'll show you the lesson that I got. I found this contact sheet. It shows all the different other poses that the young boy with the hand grenade was in. There he is playing around the fountain in the lower left. Both of the straps of his shorts are up. He's prancing around, he's playing. But the one that she chose from the contact sheet, and this is just a little boy, he was a son of one of the people that were working with her on the shoot in Central Park. He's playing like he's a Marvel character, clenching his mouth and saying, I'm tough, I'm gonna throw this, like a little kid does. He's pretending. But that was not my initial take, and probably many people's initial take when they showed this shot that Diane Arbus shows. I'm not saying it's less artistic. I'm not saying that she's wrong. I'm just saying that I do believe that Diane Arbus was showing everyday life and beauty within sometimes deformity that she saw in life. The next one is another photographer. She is listed now as the third highest paying artist in New York, which I would say probably means that she's the third highest paid artist in the United States. They're certainly up among the top 10. Take a good look at her. You probably know her, Cindy Sherman. Look at what she looks like. Looks like she's probably in her maybe late 30s in this picture. She was born in 54, so that makes her, what, 70 now? Holy cow. Anyway, every picture now that you see, every photograph will be a photograph, a selfie that Cindy Sherman did of herself. This is a series that she did on 50s and 60s films. She did sort of generic film noir stereotypes of women that were in these movies. The working girl on the left, the abused person in the middle, the little ingenue on the right. She did a whole series of these. There were 70 of them in all. She did a whole series on historical pictures and pictures from art. I've shown the one on the left. This is her as Caravaggio, his Bacchus, a man. In the middle and on the right, we have two Renaissance portraits of women nursing. Cindy Sherman is all three of these people. She's using wigs and makeup, of course. She also is using a prosthetic breast to talk about the fascination with the breast in terms of when women breastfeed in public. So she gets very subtle little pieces of her feelings into her art. Is it satire? Look at the women on the left. Heavily made up. It's easy for me to connect them with the two women on the far right that we just saw from Diane Arbus. At the top, we see these stereotypical nerds, the young women who are perhaps in a college who are thought of that way. Down below, I have Grant Wood's women of the Daughters of the Revolution. In the little smirks in the faces, particularly in the way that she's smirking in the portrait on the left, we get just a little touch of these people seeing, as Arbus says, seeing themselves differently from the way the world sees them. And that was one of the things that she was showing us. Do you know this painter? She is now the most famous living female artist in the world. She's 88. She was born in Japan. She was born in a home where they had a seed farm and a nursery, so she really got to know plants. All of these paintings behind Yokoi Kasuma here are ones that show that influence from that organic background. Particularly look at the one on the right. Does that remind you of the David Hockney that we looked at, and a little bit of the Wayne Thiebaud, looking at the bird's eye view of the vegetation? She also is a costumer. She's an installation artist. And let's look a little bit more at what she's famous for. She has a design compulsion. She does have a mental illness that has carried her, taken her throughout her life. She has hallucinations. She has various bouts with mental illness. And she has said that she would die if she didn't have her art. And I talked about this compulsion for design earlier. Many times it's the polka dots you see on the pumpkin. See, the pumpkin down below was installed on an island in Japan, and it went out to sea. Her art was destroyed by a typhoon. Thank you for correcting my spelling. Everybody, I think on the chat, we got a correction of my spelling of that name. I've been in her infinity rooms or looking out at them, where with mirrors and lights and reflections, you actually go into a whole other world. And that sort of makes me think about when mental illness is involved, such as with Van Gogh, with other artists, does it really make any difference in terms of what they create? And I would say, no, we end up with beautiful works of art, no matter where it comes from. And these are incredible happenings or installations that she did. Here's one that was in the Botanical Gardens in New York on the left, and one of her squid-like characters in Berlin. And here, like with Richard said, a big piece that you can walk through, so you can sort of have a life in polka dots. So she is still working, she's still creating, she has this need to keep on going, and she does live in a mental institution in Tokyo. She's out free, she committed herself, as did Van Gogh, and she goes out and about, but she's still creating, and her work is very, very popular. Now we're going to talk about people, women, who are using their art to make a point. Some of it is a little bit hard to look at, as I said with Frida Kahlo, but it all is mostly contemporary, where women have just broken the mold as to what women can do, and they're saying, look at, I have a voice too. Whether it's a voice about feminism, Black lives, they are voicing themselves through their art. The first artist, who's also still living, is Faith Ringgold. Let's look at a video about her.
Lush, colorful, daring. Each piece, each artistic phase tells a story. The signature style of artist Faith Ringgold.
The process is so wonderful.
She is best known for these, her story quilts. A patchwork of images with a story written right onto the fabric. This one, Tar Beach, was adapted into a now beloved award-winning children's book.
Why are these girls so happy?
Why not?
But in fact, Ringgold's work spans over 70 years, an observation of decades of social upheaval in America.
When people said one thing, you would say, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Yes, because that's necessary. If you want to do something, you cannot just go by what other people want.
A consummate fighter for justice, Ringgold, now 90, struggled to be seen and heard as a Black female artist through the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the women's liberation movement of the 1970s.
I constantly looked for the galleries that accepted Black artists. If I asked and they said no, it didn't bother me, because I expected to hear no.
Born in Harlem in 1930, Ringgold credits her determination to her parents. Due to debilitating asthma, she was educated mostly at home, which she says gave her the freedom to be herself.
I think there was a lot of feeling at that time that we can't do this, we can't do that. Oh, yes, we can. We can do it. All you gotta do is try.
So when the art world rejected her or tried to pigeonhole her work, she fought back.
What was their difficulty with you and your work?
First of all, I painted white people.
By then, she was teaching at a New York City high school by day and painting by night. This 1962 piece is called 4 Women at a Table.
So you were one of the Black teachers there, but you weren't allowed at that table?
I noticed that I wasn't invited. Did I want to sit with them? Of course. I wanted to be included, but you're supposed to stay with the Black people and don't paint white people, because white people were considered superior. And if you painted them in such a way that they were characterized in one way or the other, then you would criticize because you were causing trouble. I painted them the way I saw them. Sorry. And
so this is Who's Afraid of Aunt Jemima.
We get different colors of hair, different colors of people.
This is a family that's interracial. If she wanted to do something, she was not going to let anything stand in her way. Whether that was experimenting with different kinds of media or techniques, she was going to do it, no matter what.
So this room has the American collection, right?
Emily Rales is director and chief curator of the Glenstone Museum in Potomac, Maryland, where a large body of Ringgold's work is currently on display.
Each decade brought a new innovation. One of the things that I feel really defines her practice is this fearlessness to take on anything.
In 1968, when New York's Whitney Museum put on a retrospective of American art from the 1930s onward that didn't include a single black artist, Ringgold protested, along with dozens of fellow black artists. In 1970, Ringgold helped organize a show in downtown Manhattan.
There were flag desecration laws in place, and there were certain people who were being arrested for doing that kind of work, and she thought that was wrong, and she was going to do something about it, you know? And so she organized a show where a bunch of artists all used the flag as their imagery, and she got arrested.
That same year, Ringgold became involved with the women's movement, fighting for women's art to be seen.
I always thought the Black Power movement was more about black men, and the feminist movement was more about white women and not women of color. Did you have the same impression?
Yes, I had to fit the women in.
And they were there.
Absolutely. So let them in.
And finally, doors have started to open,
Did you ever dance on the George Washington Bridge yourself?
Not yet.
Okay.
thanks in part to her own perseverance.
I have kind of forgotten the sharp feeling I used to get of being rejected. And maybe it has to do with being left out so many times. Go ahead, leave me out if you want. I'll come in another door.
Have you felt more free as you've gotten older?
As you get older, you become more free. If you will take advantage of the freedom that you have attained. Anyone can fly. All you got to do is try.
I love that ending, anything you can fly if you try it. And that, of course, is the feeling of the child in Tar Beach. And they have their little picnic up on the roof, where the roof is covered with this tar paper. And the child is able to dream her way into flying away. And of course, it is also in the children's book. There's those women at the table. Here, once again, my comparisons. Looking at point of view, she is showing the two women on either side, kind of having a stare down. None of them look particularly happy. So there is a point of view about those ladies. Here's an entirely different style. This is an homage to Josephine Baker, the American woman, Black woman who went to Paris, was the rage of Paris, was a resistance fighter, was an entertainer. She's shown in the picture on the left, which has a very Matisse look. As a matter of fact, she's put a piece of the Matisse on the right, which is Matisse's Red Room, into her painting. And this one, hard to look at, where you see the blacks and the whites fighting. You see the children crouching together, the white child and the black child crouching in the front, the man who's being shot falling over them, the blood dripping. It reminds you of Guernica, which I'm not showing now. I'm going to show it again a little bit later. And it also has overtones of feelings of rage. And I think, like with Guernica, Ringgold succeeds in rage. And I thought, as a connection, remembering back to when we looked at Jacob Lawrence, when he did this painting called Confrontation on the Bridge, which is his interpretation of the freedom riders that are walking across with Martin Luther King, John Lewis, across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, only be met by marshals as they tried to cross, which is here depicted by a wolf with a gaping maw. Both of them are stylized. They're done simply in colors, and the emotions come through very strongly. And then, of course, that's true with the one that we saw, the flag is bleeding. The next artist is another photographer, Carrie Mae Weems. We've already looked at her work a couple of times, and we'll look at some of it again today. We saw previously in George Lucas's collection that he had Carrie Mae Weems. She did this kitchen table series, all with her as the Black woman. We're reminded of the home fires that we've talked about and showed in the overhead light in the Van Gogh Potato Eaters and in Guernica. And looking at Guernica here, it reminds you of how much it's like that dye painting we just saw by Ringgold. So her object was to show everyday life, which you very, if ever, had seen through a Black point of view. Just like the Impressionists were showing the sweet life of the Impressionists through all white figures, she showed it through the Black point of view. On the left, her self-portrait, both the adult and the child, could be mother and daughter, are looking into the mirror. She used a lot of mirrors because she's very interested in the Black woman's image of herself. Contrasting this with Cassatt in the middle, the same subject, and of course, Balado, who we just saw with the same subject, the child growing up, looking into the mirror and not at the mother. More of the self-image as seen in a Black woman. The picture on the left is Mary J. Blige. Did I get it right? Mary J. Blige and Carrie Weems. And it's labeled, "You are engaged in a critical act of looking." So we're looking at the woman looking at herself, and a woman is looking at the woman looking at herself. In this one on the right of Goya, what a dark point of view he had of the two women that are engaged in looking at themselves. And as I was working on this, the same time that we went to San Francisco to see the Diego Rivera, they had this special room in the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. One of the pictures on the wall, one of the artworks on the wall in neon says, "Fantastic to feel beautiful again." It's about women's self-image. And here we see on the left, the antebellum costumes that Scarlett O'Hara might have worn when slavery was in time, and they're made with African cloth, the cloth that we looked at Shonabari earlier. And the one on the wall is done by Mickaleen Thomas, and it is called Sukwa. I know that's not right. There's so many Z's and Q's. I wish I were playing Words with Friends, because I'd get big points if I spelled that word, but it is called A Very Beautiful Negress. And it is based on the negress that was used in Monet's Olympia, the one I said that I'd show you later, who is offering the flowers to Olympia. The picture at the top is a study that Monet did for that picture. This is a picture of a Black transgender woman that Mickaleen painted off and on, and it was the big picture that we saw in the room that we just looked at. So back to Carrie Mae Weems. Here she is, again, a reflection, thinking, meditating in her room, all alone. Dancing as if there's no one watching. And I thought right away of this picture by Degas on the right, of the woman also dancing in sunlight in front of the windows. This artist was portrayed in the subway of New York by Chuck Close, who is shown in his portrait down below. These portraits are made of thousands of little abstract designs that work together to make a realistic portrait. And I'm showing this picture of this artist because of Chuck Close's passing last month. And that artist is Carl Walker. She's one of the youngest artists that we'll look at. And I'm saying that she worked on the cutting edge of telling tales. Let's look at what I meant by cutting edge. She worked with silhouettes. She did lots of other art, but she's most famous for this. Silhouettes, you might have done this with your children or your grandchildren, like you put a sharp light on a profile of a child and put it on the wall and trace around it, cut it out in black paper, put it on white, and you have one of these silhouettes. Sweet little patriotic scene, happy family, antebellum woman. Let's look at Carol Walker's silhouettes. This is an art installation she did at MoMA in New York. And I am not giving the whole title because it has and you can certainly Google it, it has a connotation that is, I think, might offend some people, and it's called Gone, an historical romance of the Civil War. Gone is from Gone with the Wind. And what it is a satire on the life that was shown in Gone with the Wind, the kind of life that the Scarlet and the rest of them were leading while the slavery was going on. Let's look at some details from this and others of her work. You can see the size of these pictures, these silhouettes that she's working on. She often would put them in the round so that you're surrounded by these images. And these are some that are hard to look at. The child who's running, cigarette in hand, about ready to eat the head that has been chopped off the chicken, looking up into the face of death and his skull hanging like a crocodile. The old man with the one leg, the sword going through the child. The woman, slave with her broom, being carried away by the master of the house. You can see his jacket there, it's split. It has that swallowtail coat and his fancy shoes, taking her off for his pleasure. In the right one, the banjo player being wound up to play again, just like they were in vaudeville, these performing Black people. We're going to a new artist now who also has a very strong point of view. We think back to Suzanne Balado. Look at this pose that she's in. We think of her also. Look at the eyes that we talked about with Suzanne Balado. And this is Alice Neel. Here she is, even as a young person, sitting with all these portraits she's done. The art of not sitting pretty. Her models don't sit pretty. Here she is. She couldn't care less that the camera is on her, probably with one of her grandchildren, looking at the paper as the artist is shooting her and some of her portraits.
Now on display, the radical paintings of a woman who didn't quite fit the mold, any mold. Alice Neel. Faith Saley is our guide.
One of the reasons I painted was to catch life as it goes by, right hot off the griddle.
That's the voice of the late artist Alice Neel, who called herself a collector of souls. And those souls are now on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City.
When people walk in and meet this image, what do you want it to tell them about the experience they're going to have with Alice Neel?
Well, I hope that they're a bit shocked.
Kelly Baum is co-curator of the exhibit called Alice Neel, People Come First.
Neel very often painted people and things that she wasn't supposed to, especially as a woman artist. And here, the candor, honesty, forthrightness with which she depicted the pregnant body.
It's almost a challenge.
It is a challenge because this is a body, especially an unclothed body, that we're not used to seeing and that frankly we're not supposed to see.
Neel was born in 1900 and grew up in Corwin, Pennsylvania. And, well, here's how she felt about that.
I lived in a small town. I hated it.
So at 21, she enrolled in the Philadelphia School of Design for Women.
I deliberately went to a girls' school because I didn't want to be distracted by boys. I was a very good-looking girl, so my whole life was disrupted by men.
Indeed, it was a disruptive man, Cuban artist Carlos Enriquez, with whom she moved to Havana to make art. Their marriage was brief and tragic. Neel painted her way through her own pain and honored the hard realities of others, especially when she moved to Spanish Harlem during the Great Depression, where she captured the people in her neighborhood.
These are two girls that Neel met in Spanish Harlem, Carmen and Antoinette Encarnacion. They're not sitters whose visages would normally have been recorded in what we think of as fine art. She was very aware of the struggles that girls like these would have faced growing up. Poverty, underinvestment from the city, illness.
No, turn your head a little away. That's a little more away. With me, painting was more than a profession. It was also an obsession. I had to paint, you know.
You didn't sit for Neel expecting to be flattered.
Randall Griffey is co-curator of the exhibit.
She's unflinching, candid. There's an egalitarian streak about her that comes through: rich, poor, black, white, brown, men, women.
Neel's unblinking focus on people meant she refused to create the kind of abstract expressionism that was bringing acclaim to her contemporaries in the 40s and 50s.
It's actually one of the reasons that she really hasn't been canonized. Modern art has been written about mostly as a succession of avant-garde isms, and Neel doesn't fall into that.
I feel like she's peopleism.
Yes, exactly. Humanism really was her ism.
Someone who knows firsthand what it was like to be revealed by Alice Neel is her daughter-in-law, Ginny Neel, who's married to one of Alice's two sons, Hartley.
She could see you better than you could see yourself in some way. I love Ginny in the striped shirt because that wasn't about what I looked like. That was about what I was feeling. I think she caught my anxiety, I think she caught, talk about zeitgeist, I think she caught that anxiety of the age, 1969, 1970, everything was going on.
Did she suggest that you sit that way? Or is that the way?
Yes, well, I sit that way.
It's such a statement.
Ginny, who knew Alice Neel for 20 years before the artist died in 1984, says there was much more to her sweet-looking mother-in-law than met the eye.
Did you call Alice Mom?
No.
Did the kids call her Grandma?
No, goodness. What did she say? She used to say, I have this apple pie face, but that's not who's inside. Mom and apple pie, that's not me.
Yet Neel's paintings are as American as apple pie in their honest revelations of who we are, the overlooked, the flamboyant, the underrepresented, and the unapologetic.
I painted in obscurity for years and years. But if I didn't paint all the time, I probably wouldn't live. That's what keeps me alive.
I think I would have liked to know her. So once again, as a collector of souls, we look into their eyes, just like we did with Arbus, and we think about what they're about. And as her daughter-in-law was saying, it's really that she is capturing what people are about. There was this show that just ended last month of her portraits, concentrates on her feeling for people. Very, very quick.
I'm calling Berkeley, so any place you want, just say the word.
The very, very quick brushwork in the background, just sort of minimal, and just honing in on those eyes. Just a reminder of how women and babies have been portrayed by the Impressionists with Renoir, Maurice, and Cassatt. Let's look at Alice Neel. She is showing the way that she encounters people in daily life. Once again, look at those minimal backgrounds. The clothing is rendered a little bit more specifically, and then we go to the eyes. Giving you a chance just to take in what you see, how you feel, looking at these two. We have the boy in Harlem, and then the tuberculosis patient that she was friendly with in Harlem, where she lived. And this one, of course, is very hard to look at. We all know Andy Warhol wearing that white wig, all dressed up, ready to go, always acting as if he could care less. Here he is in a portrait that he let Alice Neel do. Look at how minimal the background is. We concentrate here on his shoes, probably. Well, no, on his deformity, because here's where he was shot in the abdomen by one of the women he worked with at his studio, which he called the factory. He had to wear a special girdle for it. It shows all of his scars. Now look at his eyes. This is the first one that we've looked at where the eyes are closed. So I think that perhaps he caught him that way, saying perhaps that the proud man was not proud, although he allowed her to do the portrait. And finally, her self-portrait at the age of 80. So we see her letting it all hang out. She's showing herself as an artist, as a wise woman, and as a very accomplished painter. There we go, Artemisia. We looked at her before, and here she is in a self-portrait as a martyr. She was showing herself as a martyr like St. Catherine, who had this wheel with spikes run over her. But I think you'll see that in her life and in her career as a painter, in the Baroque period, she was far from a martyr. But at that time, as she was working, she was extremely strong as a woman. She's known for all of her paintings of Susanna and the Elders. The one on the left was done when she was 17. After this, she was raped, which is the subject of Susanna and the Elders. And you see in the following two portraits how each time Susanna is getting stronger. So the one that's done in 1652, it looks like she's trying to talk the elders out of raping her. And here on the left, we have Judith slain Holofernes by Artemisia Gentileschi. And on the right, by her fellow painter in the Italian Baroque period, Caravaggio. Her painting shows Judith, who in the Bible story has her, as a Jewish woman, her town has been invaded by Assyrians. Holofernes was the head of them. Head, it's kind of a double meaning. And she dresses herself up, sort of seduces him, gets him drunk, and then takes off his head. In her painting, Judith is even stronger than in Caravaggio. She's really getting into it. We see the blood dripping down the side, so that what we have is her asserting herself. She was very popular. She lost favor later, so many people haven't heard about her. She's certainly coming back into favor now, but Artemisia Gentileschi, you can read The Passion of Artemisia, the story of her life.